And
Hi,
hi, how are you doing?
good. How are you?
I'm great. Um, it's Neil or Dr. Guha?
It's Neil. Yeah, not a doctor yet.
Not yet, not yet. Right. How many years are you in right now?
I just finished my fourth year, so I have 2 more years left.
Nice, awesome. You're
Yeah.
working in law and AI? That's a really interesting combination, I thought.
Yeah, it's fun. Two very different communities, but
For sure.
they both care and work on really interesting problems, even though they approach the world in very different ways. So it's fun to get to be a part of both of them.
Right, for sure. Right. So yeah, I'm here. Uh, and I appreciate you taking your time to come and meet with me. We had just a couple questions about your work. We thought you were really like interesting, like I said, mix between law and just want to learn more. So
Yeah. Can you remind me again what's the context? I know you mentioned there's a high school organization. Sorry.
right. So at our high school, we're near the Boston area. We essentially during the school year we have like weekly meetings where we just discuss some, topics in AI. And your work came across, so we just
Wow.
reading about other stuff. We just read about your work and we're really interested.
Awesome. Wow, that's very flattering.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah. So yeah, maybe we'll just get started here. Could you do you mind if I record this to show to other people?
Yeah, I mean, what's the who's all's gonna see the recording or?
I primarily just, colleagues in the club. That's it
Okay,
really.
yeah, for sure. As long as
Right.
you don't put it up online.
Sure.
But if you want to just ask me and let me just see it. But yeah.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, let's get started here. Do you think you could just like kind of introduction type thing? Do you think you could tell me a little bit about like yourself and your journey in AI and law?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was a high school senior and starting, or I guess right after high school senior year, when I was starting college, undergrad, I was really interested in computer science and also interested in policy. I grew up in the California Bay Area, so Silicon Valley was everywhere, and there's a huge amount of excitement around technology here. And I think as a high school student growing up in that atmosphere, it's sort of the thing everyone wants to do. But I also vividly remember watching The West Wing in high school, which may not be the most accurate TV show now, but it was a wonderful TV show. And I think that and a combination of really wonderful history teachers in high school instilled an interesting interest in public policy and politics. And then throughout undergrad, I tried to sort of do both. So I was a computer science major. I did internships at tech companies. I did computer science research, all the things that engineering majors typically do. But I also did some policy internships. I spent a quarter working at the Federal Communications Commission. I took a bunch of history classes. And I was always trying to figure out how I wanted to balance that. And I think one of the first turning points was I took a class on civil rights law, basically to fulfill a graduation requirement. I had zero experience with lawyers before. I didn't know any lawyers. There were none in my family. I'd never really thought about law or law school as on my career path. But I really fell in love with the discipline through the class, the way law school and sort of the legal approach is to try and break down complex problems and think rigorously through them in an almost algorithmic nature. Sorry, let me mute my notifications. Um, if anything, the sort of the civil rights law class reminded me a lot about the introduction to theory courses you're required to take as a computer science major, where they basically teach you how to write proofs. And in many ways, you can think about writing proofs as a form of structuring, and there are rules about what you can and can't do in proofs. And in the same way, there are these sort of implicit rules about the ways you can and can't make legal arguments. Um, After that, I was very unsure of like what I wanted to do. I honestly thought I took the class late in undergrad, so I thought it was too late to do law school. And I was doing a master's in computer science at Carnegie Mellon or a master's in machine learning at Carnegie Mellon. And I think it was John Kleinberg came down from Cornell. And at the time, he was doing a lot of work around algorithmic fairness. And it was this really eye-opening moment for me because was hearing someone talk not only about machine learning models, which is something I was really interested in, but also talk about them in the context of civil rights law and anti-discrimination. And I remember chatting with a bunch of people after, and they said, if you're really interested in this, you should consider doing both and combining the two. And there's this new program that's common for other disciplines, but at the time less common for computer science, which is a JD PhD. And so you get to go to law school and be a law student, but you also get to do a PhD. And it's the type of program where you can do it and then you can do whatever you want afterwards. You can go be a lawyer, you can go be a computer science person, you can find a job where you get to do both. And so yeah, that's how I got into this. And it's been loads of fun since.
Right. Yeah, so you'd say that civil class was really what sort of sparked your interest there, that really like started it, and then you just took and ran with it.
Yeah, I think the civil rights law class was really my first exposure to the formal thinking that characterizes legal analysis and law. And um, it it made me realize that some of the things computer scientists do aren't all that different from what lawyers do. And there's a sort of like intellectual formality underlying both of them, which I really appreciated.
Hmm. Okay, for sure. Yeah, great. We were like interested in some of your research because I know you don't really get to see a lot of work that combines the two subjects here. So I was wondering, maybe if there's a specific research topic that you did recently that you'd like to discuss, or I have one here about your generative AI benchmark paper that you did in the Oxford Press. If there was maybe like a certain research paper where you'd like to give us a kind of a simple overview on the research that you conducted there, we'd really be interested in that.
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about a project we did called Legal Bench, which I think is talked about in the Oxford chapter. So the way so if you think about complex products or complex technologies like pharmaceuticals or cars, we have a system of technical processes which allow us to make sure these products are safe. So for pharmaceutical drugs, we have clinical trials. For cars, we have crash tests. The set of processes we use similarly in the context of AI to determine whether a particular AI system or machine learning model is well or is safe is called evaluation, but it also goes by benchmarking. And it's a very complex technical practice in and of itself. And I think one of the things you'll sometimes hear is that evaluating machine learning systems is almost as complicated as building them. Um, the general broad of how you evaluate machine learning models is as follows. The first thing you'll do is you'll collect a data set for some task. And you can think about this data set in terms of the inputs you feed the model and the outputs you want the model to produce. So if I had a machine learning model that I was thinking about deploying in a hospital to help doctors diagnose whether a particular patient had pneumonia, let's say from their chest x-ray, the input to this model might be images of chest x-rays from real world patients, and the outputs would be whether those patients actually had pneumonia or not. And the way I'd given a model, the way I'd evaluate it is I'd take these inputs in this data set, I'd feed them into the model, and I'd observe what the model predicted for each chest x-ray. So whether the model believed that the patient in the x-ray has pneumonia or not. And then I'd compare the model's prediction to what I know to be the ground truth prediction that I have in my data set. And so you might be able to say, well, for the first patient, the model gets it right. For the second patient, the model gets it wrong, and so on and so forth. But if you do this process at the end, what you can say is like, oh, the model was 75%, was correct 75% of the time. Or you can make even more specific statements like, on women, the model was X% accurate, but on men, it was Y% accurate, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a process of evaluation, and it allows us to figure out how good models are, when we're comfortable with the error rates, and what we need to be aware of when we deploy them. So for instance, is a model performing particularly worse on a subgroup of patients? The same principle, the same broad approach applies to when we think about using AI in the context of the legal profession, whether that's building a chatbot to help people answer questions about what the laws in their local jurisdiction are, whether judges are trying to use generative models to help them write opinions, whether law firms are using models to classify which documents are relevant or identify terms and contracts that are important for some purpose. What Legal Bench was this project where we said, all right, let's try and gather as many data sets as we can that can be used to evaluate large language models for legal tasks. And so what we went different legal academics, different legal impact labs, law firms, excuse me, and lawyers, and asked them, can you help us build a data set for a task you think large language models could be helpful for in the context of the law? So come up with the inputs and the outputs. And because we're dealing with large language models, the inputs have to be text. And we'll
Right.
work with you to assemble this into a giant benchmark and use it to evaluate a bunch of different large language models. And so I think that was a really exciting project for two reasons. The first is that benchmarks are very important from a scientific perspective. They're what allow us in the context of machine learning to to learn about whether certain models or certain modeling choices work well or poorly. Um, and so the problem with law is that we actually don't have that many legal benchmarks because historically the legal community hasn't been that engaged in AI and computation. And building legal benchmarks is hard. It's hard to get lawyers time, they're very expensive. And the exciting thing about Legal Bench was that we were able to essentially like build this community around building a benchmarks. I think something like 40 plus people were involved in the project in terms of helping run benchmarks or contribute data. And the set of tasks we got overall were north of 160. And so I think that was a really exciting project, not only for what we were able to produce, but also for the way we were able to do it.
Sure. One question I did have regarding that was you mentioned, tasks that lawyers who you worked with think that LLMs would be good at. From what, maybe, I'm only a high schooler, so I'm not exactly at the forefront of all this, but from what I've heard, large language models aren't particularly like very, very good at least right now at doing a lot of like state-of-the-art legal things. So maybe could you maybe go into what kind of tasks the people who you worked with thought LLMs would be good at, or if you have any examples of those types of things?
Yeah, so it's this really tricky conversation in the law because there are so many different things that lawyers actually do, and LLMs are already good at some of them. We think LLMs could get much better at some of them. And there's a third category where we're not sure that the current generation of models within the next five or models within the next 5 years might become good at. So maybe just some like illustrative examples across these tasks. So one place where LLMs are actually quite good is for tasks that involve classifying text data. And this is quite common in the legal profession. So let's say I wanted to find all of let's say I had a database of contracts, and I wanted to find all of the contracts which had a clause that had a particular legal effect. So maybe, for instance, I wanted to find clauses which capped the certain amount. Ordinarily, you might think about how you look for those clauses using keyword terms, but that can be very inefficient and it can take a lot of time. And what we've found is that LLMs are fairly good at if you feed it a set of contractual clauses and ask, does this tell me tell me yes or no whether the clause has some effect, it can produce pretty accurate predictions. I think one area where LLMs right now struggle in terms of legal tasks, but there's some optimism that they could actually get better is with regards to doing sort of research tools and case law analysis. So the biggest problem here is that LLMs have a propensity to hallucinate. They will um, produce generations which we would recognize as not being correct or untrue. And one area where there's a lot of work is on how we can mitigate this property in LLMs. And so there's a bunch of research on how you can potentially design LLMs in a way that reduces the likelihood of them producing misstatements or falsehoods. And so it's still a little bit TBD on what is the ultimate ceiling we can get here and how much these tools can improve. But I think it's a really exciting area to keep an eye on.
Sure. Yeah, I think I was thinking more along the lines of that research and case law analysis type thing, but I see what you're going getting at. I mean, just like there's a bunch of models like maybe in terms of like image analysis that can tell if this is a cat or this is a dog. So I could see how, large language models might be effective at identifying certain clauses that contain certain implications. So
And I mean, like, so you're in high school, but so you haven't yet had to do this, but when you graduate and you get a job or you move in someplace, you're going to have to sign a bunch of legal agreements. You're going to have to sign leases, employment contracts, various insurance agreements, so on and so forth for pretty much the rest of your life. And most people don't read any of the agreements they're signing. And oftentimes you sign agreements where it's not entirely clear all of the provisions in that agreement would actually be enforceable against you. And so one of the sort of biggest problems in the law is that most people don't walk around with what the law is in their head, and we shouldn't expect them to. And so there's a lot of optimism that maybe introduced in the right way, LLMs could help mitigate these information asymmetries. They could help people figure out when they're signing leases that are predatory or allow people to better modify or negotiate on these sorts of agreements.
sure. Yeah, yeah, that's definitely a smart assistant could be very, very helpful for a lot of people in the future. So I think maybe a couple more questions regarding legal bench. What would you say are some of like the key challenges you tackled? I know you talked about, you had to reach out to a lot of different places, but just generally, what would you say some key challenges and maybe even like key conclusions, like coming off the challenges and just in general, key challenges,
Yeah. So one social challenge I think when you're or is when you work at the intersection of two fields is that you have to do a lot of translational work. So when we were trying to build Legal Bench, we'd frequently have conversations with folks on the law side who were really excited about the project, but maybe we're less familiar with what a benchmark was, how you construct one, why is the data formatted a particular way, why do we run these sorts of experiments. And so one challenge there was trying to explain it and trying to put it in sort of what computer scientists do in terms that someone from another community can understand. And this isn't just exclusively a CS and law challenge. I have friends who work at the intersection of CS and medicine or CS and education, and they run into similar challenges. I think a technical challenge was figuring out how we um, sort of want to structure this benchmark in terms of what tasks matter. One of the things when you're creating a benchmark is that you want the information produced by the benchmark to not only be intelligible to computer scientists, but also understandable to lawyers. In other words, lawyers should see a number and it should make sense to them.
Right,
Um, and so trying to think about how we created the sort of conceptual scaffolding around the benchmark so that lawyers can look at this task and understand what it means and understand what a performance score on this task means. And I'm so sorry, I forgot the second part of your key conclusions about from
yeah, I
legal.
think just extensions coming off those challenges, if you had any.
Yeah, so I think there's uh one challenge we didn't solve in legal bench, but we're very excited by is so when I described benchmarking before, I talked about the idea of like you have a classification task and you say you can look at the model's prediction and say, is this correct or not? But you can't really do the same when you're asking the model to generate free-flowing text, right? If I ask a model to say, give me a description about what diversity jurisdiction is, there are many ways a model could phrase that description
Sure.
that would be correct. And so one of the biggest challenges in evaluation for generative models is understanding how you look at multiple possible, or how you assess open-ended text from models where there are multiple possible answers. Um, One of the key conclusions of Legal Bench was actually what I mentioned earlier, that we found that these models were pretty good at classification tasks, that they struggled with more knowledge-intensive tasks where you could
Sure.
say there's room for hallucination.
Right. Okay. Um, so you taught, I mean, benchmarks are definitely a key aspect of like, any future research, they're definitely a staple to understand how the performance of the model is happening. Outside of that, could you speak towards any other potential real world applications of the data that you collected, or would it primarily be along the lines of evaluating models?
Yeah, so I think that legal bench data is primarily intended for evaluation. One interesting question is whether you could actually use it to develop better models.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
and I think folks have started to explore that question, but it's still a bit early days. But are excited to look at it and potentially follow up work.
Right, for sure. Um, I'm not sure how well this question applies here, but just like generally, there's always a talk about ethics and fairness in machine learning and even in the data that's collected for these machine learning projects. How would you, maybe if you did or if you could talk about it, how would you say that you address the importance of fairness in your research there?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things about Legal Bench was most of the tasks ended up being tasks relating to civil law, so not in the criminal justice system,
Right, right,
to where classifications were being made over uh, legal texts where a person wasn't involved. So clauses in contracts, descriptions of hypothetical fact patterns. One thing which isn't exactly about fairness, but I think is related into the notion of AI ethics, which you always worry about, is privacy considerations with data. And this is particularly an issue in the legal setting where maybe a lot of the data you want to use to evaluate models because it corresponds to real world questions, real world
right.
factual settings, does is generated by people or it does talk about people's like the events that people have gone through and so it isn't private in that sense.
That
And I
was
think
one of
it's
the questions I was gonna. That was one of the future questions, and sharing interest in here.
yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
and it's a huge amount of it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. You see the same thing in medicine where you want to use patient data to evaluate machine learning models. And because patient data is the most accurate data, and if you want a realistic depiction of how a model is going to perform, you need to apply it on real data. But this is patient data, which contains very sensitive information. And so you don't want to distribute this widely. And these, like this tension between wanting to preserve privacy, but wanting to share evaluation data as much as possible so that everyone can perform evaluation, I think underlies a lot of different disciplines, not just law, but also education and medicine and others.
Right. Okay, for sure. Yeah. That's I could really we could really talk about this for a long time. There's so many questions I have regarding this topic. So maybe I'll get to, three or four more here. So,
Yeah.
I think maybe this isn't primarily regarding that idea of a data set or benchmark here, but just more generally about law and AI. A couple questions about that. Um, this might be more of a general question here, but what would you say like in this is an example? I don't know if you touch on this, but what would you say is like an example of a legal problem or a legal question that was previously, difficult to study, but is relatively now possible with AI, if that's something that, you
Oh,
discussed.
yeah. So this is really exciting. So, classically, the way lawyers would ask empirical questions or do empirical legal studies is or sorry, let me take a step back. So most legal data underlying empirical studies in the law is text, right? Statutes, contracts, legal agreements, legal opinions, and etc. And this makes performing empirical legal analyses very hard because you want to convert this text data into structured data. But the only way to do that is to really have trained lawyers or law students or legal researchers sit down and manually annotate each of these legal texts, right?
Right.
So law professors will often have these teams of RAs where they'll read maybe 1,000 opinions and manually code them, or thousands of statutes. And if they can't read that many, they might use keywords, but keywords can often be inaccurate, which makes the results of these studies less reliable. The promising thing about AI is that we can potentially use tools like large language models to automate a lot of this labeling. And it means that more people can do empirical legal research because it doesn't need to be the case that you can afford to pay a team of RAs and look through a huge amount of legal data. Instead of taking samples of data and studying those samples, we can now study the entire population. So instead of saying, I'm going to take a random sample of statutes across states, we can say, I'm going to study all 95 million clauses of state law going back 20 years. And I think this is it'll be really, really exciting to see how this goes over the next few years. There's already been some work on this where folks have tried using LLMs to help them study or automate things that previously they would have had to rely on law students to do.
Right. I think that's one of the things that, we talk about a lot now with AI is the idea of accessibility. And I think that that's definitely, what you mentioned here is definitely one of those aspects and how it relates to law here. So I think that's definitely, one of those good things that AI that comes out of AI. Maybe another question regarding that. So I think we think of AI, at least from my perspective, is that as AI has gotten more and more advanced, a lot of a term thrown around a lot is this idea of like black box, right? And black box is typically associated with unaccountable. I wouldn't say maybe not, particularly unpredictable, but to an extent, I guess. So how does the nature of AI models being that black box, how does that affect or guide how we choose regulations to put in place for such models?
Yeah, I think the black box discussion is a little bit tricky for a few reasons. I think the first is that computer scientists would say that even though, so they would say AI systems and machine learning models tend to be black boxes in the sense that you can't explain or you can't really deduce a clean set of rules or heuristics they're operationalizing, right? So you can't always say, why is this model giving me this prediction on this input? But they can be made predictable, right? Through tools like evaluation. So I can quantify and say, I know the likelihood that a machine learning model is going to make a mistake on this sample. And I know the probability that a large language model might, over a particular data distribution, produce a certain type of output. So even if I can't explain how it works, I can pretty precisely tell you what type of behavior you should expect out of it. Um, I think the second thing is if you think about black boxes, I don't know how it works. Most people don't know how most of the technology they interact with works, right? I can't explain how vaccines work, but I still get vaccinated and I trust the medical expertise of doctors. I can't explain how a car engine works or how an airplane works or how various financial markets work. And non-expert judges who similarly aren't trained in pharmaceuticals or AI or automotive manufacturing or airplanes are able to still preside over a legal system that can make reasonably smart decisions or reasonably good judgments about each of these technologies. So I think there is an argument that sometimes we overrate that something is a black box. There are lots of black boxes around us. Oh God, there was one more part to your question. Yeah. So, I think you asked about what is the implication for regulation? And I think
Right, right.
the sort of essential idea is the fact that we already exist in a society where there are a lot of black boxes, but these black boxes have gotten safer over time, and we are able to govern them quite effectively. And so the challenge for AI is trying to understand really why are we able to do it for these black boxes and what are the insights we need to import into the context of AI regulation.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting idea that we already live in a society with like, to the average person, everything, a lot of things around us. Like, I mean, I took a flight a couple weeks ago and I don't know how the engine works. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting idea there that, as it gets more advanced, I think like as people get used to using AI in their daily lives, maybe the idea of a black box will just not be as relevant because we already think of there's already black boxes everywhere around us. I think that's
Yeah.
definitely an interesting idea.
And I think lawyers would also argue that a lot of social decision-making processes are black boxes. You get decisions from employers, government makes decisions all the time, your teachers make decisions when grading, and you don't always get an explanation or an understanding of why that decision is being made. The other advantage about AI over human decision making is that you can ask an AI system to repeat its decision over and over again, and it is unaffected by that process. Whereas if you keep asking a human to make a decision over and over again, the very act of questioning them about their decision is going to affect
Right.
the explanation you get and
Right.
the types of predictions they will predict in the future. It's very easy to interrogate AI models.
Right.
It's very
Right.
hard to interrogate humans.
Right. Okay, for sure. Yeah. I think great. Yeah, a lot of cool things there. So I think two questions just to wrap it up here. Um, I think we talk about AI as being like an assistant to judges in the or judges or any legal professions. Here, what do you think, in the movies, when we think about AI in courtrooms, sometimes an idea that's brought up is, AI judges, but maybe not, this question isn't really geared towards AI judges. So my question is really about what are your thoughts on like the potential for AI to maybe predict court decisions, like the decisions of judges in the court, and how might that affect our legal system, if possible at all?
So one way this is already being used is when, so most lawsuits never end in settlements. So either one side drops the claims or one party agrees to pay some damages to the other party. And what often informs these settlements is some expectation about what would happen if they went to court and what a judge would rule. And so increasingly, people are using computational systems to sort of factor into settlement debates. So can I predict what a judge would do? And that sets the mark for how we're going to negotiate. So that's one way it's already being used.
Right. Okay, for sure. Yeah. And then, what are your thoughts about AI as a judge? Is that something that's a feasible idea or
I think I don't think we'll have. I think it's a tricky conversation. One, I think there's a lot of aspects about judges which are independent of the actual task they're doing. And it's more that this is an officer of the state to whom we have trust in the process. They are very, very well credentialed. They have typically gone through some um, sort of vetting process by individuals who are democratically appointed, and we have procedures in place to recall judges or launch investigations of judges if we think there's misconduct. And we think for the weight of decisions they make, it is important to have a human face or a human element
right?
on that.
Hmm.
I think your belief about whether you think AI systems can or eventually get to are good enough to do things that judges do really depends on what you think are the set of mental processes judges are applying. And so there are some folks who think that, you know, uh, really what judges are doing are looking at two arguments, seeing which one they think is better, and then just repeating it back in an opinion. But you know, a lot of folks would say what judges actually do is far more complicated. So it's a difficult question to answer because it's almost not a question about AI, it's a question about, what do you think judges are doing?
Right, for sure. Yeah, I think that was a loaded question there. So
It's a good
I think,
question.
yeah, I think we are kind of running out on time here. I think only
Yeah.
40 minutes on Zoom, although we could definitely talk about this all day, I think. But maybe one question to wrap it up here. What advice would you give to like a student like me who's like interested in AI and definitely law, and maybe how you would, negotiate that space and how you would move forward in that? Because I think they are at face value, they are two kind of separate fields. So,
Yeah.
just quickly here if you did. Sorry, don't mean to
I would
rush.
no, I my advice would be to take intellectual risks and be open to trying things where you might fail or you might realize you didn't like it. And that there's extraordinary amount of growth that happens when you are doing something difficult out of your comfort zone and forcing yourself to learn a new skill. I think when I look back on the most valuable, most important things I did in undergrad and high school, or even now in grad school, they all had that vibe where I felt very uncomfortable. I felt like I was doing something I had no expertise in, that I felt like I was having to learn a lot. And I think the other most important thing I'd add is always try and be in a room where you feel like you know the least, or you are quote unquote the dumbest person, because that's when you do the most amount of learning. Is to
Sure.
just try and like relentlessly surround yourself by people
Right.
who you think are smarter than you.
For sure. Okay, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a lot. A lot of people do touch on that, but I think it speaks to the importance of that idea. Like always surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you and learning from them, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did want to touch on one thing regarding that. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I appreciate all of your time here, and I really thank you so much for taking. I did want to add one thing here. So typically when I tend to send these out, I tend to make them public videos on YouTube. So I know that that is publicly accessible to people. So I was wondering if, if you're okay with me sending like an edited version of this, I could publish that online. If there's any topics that you wanted me to cut out or blur, I could definitely do that too. So any comments you have on, making this a public.
Um, yeah, I think it's fine actually. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean when I tried to make it this in such a way that I wouldn't have to ask eh, too much information that isn't already publicly available. So I
Yeah.
just to right.
Yeah, no, I think it's fine.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
great. I appreciate that a lot. Well, thank you so much for all your time, Neil. I really appreciate it.
Of course, it was wonderful to meet you.
And yeah, if you have no more questions for us, I think that should be it here.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It sounds wonderful. Let me know if anything else comes up and I can be helpful in any way.
For sure. Yeah, definitely stay in touch. All right. Have a great day.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.